And hello, my fabulous students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I'm excited to be with you today. Today, we are going to talk about the social inequalities that occurred among different empires and civilizations in the classical period. So, let us begin. So one of the greatest examples of inequality is known as the Indian caste system. We have Aryan society, and the Aryans came, of course, as you already know, and they came down into the subcontinent of India around following the Ganges River, and they started mingling with the remnant or the indigenous people of the old Harappan civilization, and they slowly made a civilization together. But as they did so, divisions arise. So you have things known as varnas, which are social divisions. And if you want to look at the Indian caste system at the very top here, the top of the social pyramid are the Brahmins. That's just a fancy word for priest. And then we have the Kshatriyas, and these were warriors and rulers. Next we have the Vaisyas, and they were merchants, craftspeople, artisans. And then we have the Sudras, which were farm workers, servants, laborers, etc. So it's understood. There's no theory to refute this, that the Aryans, when they first came down, the Aryans, they were fair-skinned, and the indigenous people of India were darker-skinned. And so it's understood that this caste system was put together to sort of uh, show superiority, if you will, between the fair-skinned and those who were not. And so as you see here, the non-Aryans or the indigenous who were darker, they fell along the Sutra line, and then the Aryans, they fell along the top three here. But as they mingled with each other, the fairer skin just started slowly going away through genetic process of having children and etc. So that's how it all begins. So we have four major caste systems within here. Let's continue on. So the rules of the caste system. Caste system divided Indian society into groups based on person's birth, wealth, or occupation. Another word for occupation would be like jati, Jati, which was also important factor when discussing the Indian caste system. Depending on what you did for a living or your jati, depended also where you fell into the caste system. Indian caste could be lost or increased, but it was rare. So mainly, wherever you fell in that Indian caste system, you're pretty much locked in for the rest of your life to be there. You couldn't go up, or I don't know why you'd want to go down, but you couldn't increase your station. And if you did, it was an extremely rare thing to do. However, you could lose your station altogether and be completely kicked out of the caste system. And those people were known as untouchables, which we will talk more about in class. Obviously, you could not marry anyone of a different caste. So if you tried to marry somebody who was not of your caste system, then the two of you would become untouchables. Therefore, you wouldn't have a place in that society. Anyway, let's continue on to China. So Confucian social hierarchy, we talked about this briefly, is based on the system where he divided everything into four classes. Of course, he has the emperor and the government leaders at the top. And then second, which is quite rare, is he has the peasants, who are second to the top. It's rare because one, peasants aren't really looked upon as in high society, and two, peasants were the largest group of people in the hierarchy, and usually it goes the least largest down to the largest towards the bottom. So that's a little different. And then of course he has artisans. Artisans he put third because they actually produce something, and then merchants. Confucian philosophy did not look highly upon merchants, mainly because they don't produce anything, they just sort of sell the things that people produce. So classes only divided people into social rank here during the Han Dynasty. They did not indicate wealth or power per se, because in many instances, you would have farmers who were second highest in the social hierarchy according to Confucius, but they were also quite poor. And many times the merchants were way more richer or wealthy than the farmers. So during Confucian philosophy, where they have his social structure going on throughout the Han Dynasty, it doesn't necessarily mean wealth or power anymore. It's more about honor in the job which you're doing. However, the merchants were usually more richer but despised. Merchants were forbidden to wear silk, ride horses, carry arms. They couldn't take the civil service exam or participate in public life. However, many merchants would then just with all that money they had, they would just train their children all their lives to take the exam. Since they weren't merchants, then they could take the exam, and if they passed, then they would go on to government and help daddy out. The revival of the family happens in the Han Dynasty. So we have children who are taught from birth to respect their leaders, or their elders, I should say. Father had absolute power. Everyone in the family had to obey him. This is known as filial piety. If you look over here at this picture, I think this is a wonderful example. Here we have the older grandfather, and then we have his son who's sitting at his bedside caring for his father, and then we have the grandson, the father's son, here taking care of both father and grandfather. So this is a great example of filial piety. You have 3 generations, and of course the oldest generation is being revered by both of them, and then the younger son is revering his father as well and serving them. So Han officials believed that if families obeyed their father, then they would also most likely obey the emperor, since he's kind of like the father of a country, if you will. Some men earned government jobs by respecting their parents. Children were expected to honor their parents through ceremonies. Chinese valued their sons over daughters because the son carries on the name and cares for the parents when they are old. So if you want to be taken care of in Chinese society, then you definitely want a son, because that son is obligated through filial piety to take care of his parents. Ban Chao, he is a Chinese writer, and he wrote a book called The Admonitions for Women. Here he emphasizes the importance that all women need to show humility, obedience, devotion to their husbands. It's the notion that, a female baby, when they're an infant, they should not be put into some kind of crib that's higher than the bed. That should show them their lowly station in life. Chinese would also give female babies a piece of a shard of pottery that they could play with, as symbolic of them, knowing from the very beginning that their job is to take care of domestic things and to be productive. So let's jump over to Greece. We're going to talk about Athens first. So we have the boys. So most Athenian boys from rich families, they got to improve both their bodies and their minds. Athens, they're a little different in Sparta, which you're going to see the contrast. But Athenian boys were encouraged to have both physical education, learn how to do wrestling and running and all that stuff, boxing. But they were also expected to improve the mind. And so that was the understanding. Also, they learned to read, they write, they would count, they would sing songs, they'd play an instrument. We would consider this kind of like a well-balanced education, if you will. They also had to study both Greek literature. They were taught by private tutors. Poor boys became farmers and craftspeople. So if you were from a wealthy family, then you were educated, and you're educated in the ways. They would even have wood tablets of wood, and they dip it in wax, and then that's what you wrote on instead of paper. And then when you were done, you just strip the wax off, you dip it into new wax, and you would use a stylus to write on it. Girls received almost no education. Most girls only learned household chores by weaving and sewing. Rich girls had private tutors for education. Married off. So women typically in Athenian society were married off around the age 15, and they married a male who was usually about 15 years older than them. So you're looking at like a 30-year-old marrying a 15-year-old. Who's literally double their age, and that was a common practice. So the men in Athens, they were all expected to join the army, and they were to devote 2 years of their life to the army. Those 2 years consisted between 18 and 20, and then after they served that time honorably, then they were able to go into Athenian life. They were able to get married, settle down, have a profession. Many males at that point would then, male citizens, would participate in the assembly or government on voting on laws and etc. Women, however, they weren't allowed to serve as government officials. They couldn't leave their homes except on special occasions. They were required to be in charge of the domestic proceedings of the house. But they could have slaves, and those slaves would attend and help them in the domestic issues of the house. But they couldn't buy anything or own property, and they couldn't disobey their husband or fathers. So Sparta. So Sparta boys, Sparta is interesting because they had a strength test for boys, infants. And they take the infant before the elders, and if that infant was considered unhealthy, they couldn't, their head was weaker, their head's flopping around everywhere because they can't keep their neck up or whatever. If it wasn't considered to be healthy, then that baby would not benefit the city-state of Sparta and the powerful warrior atmosphere that they're trying to exude. So they would then take the baby, place the baby in some kind of a what's where I'm looking for, some kind of a pod or something that they would put the baby in, and they would take the baby out to past the city walls, and they would leave the baby out there to be consumed and die. It's one of those things you look and you're like, huh? But that's the truth. So they had a strength test. If the babies passed the strength test, the babies went on to live in society. If not, they would take them to the walls of the city and sort of give them back to nature. Healthy boys were trained from early age to be soldiers. To make the boys tough, they were not given shoes. They had to wear light clothes during the winter, and were not given a lot of food. In fact, they would give these kids no food when they first go into it's not the army, but it's sort of like the youth who get ready to go in the army. They gather them together, and they wouldn't feed them any money or food, and they'd have to learn how to steal and to rob and to basically just get by on their wits. That there was no compassion, if you will. Courage and strength were more important than their own safety. At this point, they're trying to teach these kids to be tough. Girls in Sparta, they're able to receive physical training like running, jumping, swimming, javelin throwing. They believed that if a Spartan woman, was strong physically, then the bearing of their children will also, when they have those children, they'll be strong as well. So a physically fit Spartan girl will one day bring about physically fit and strong and healthy Spartan babies. And then when they get into manhood, from age 20 to 30 years of age, men lived in army barracks and rarely visited their families. So there's 10 years of full-time army service in Sparta. Men stayed in the army as reserves, in case needed for war until 60 years old. So after 30 years, they stop being a full-time soldier. At that point, they then get to go back into society, marry, settle down, have children, have some kind of a profession. But until age 60, they're always on Army Reserve here. They can be called anytime they go to war. Most important quality in a soldier were self-discipline and obedience. They didn't have comforts because they thought it made you weak. And of course, we have the women. The women had a lot more rights than the Athenian women did, and so and mainly because their husbands were constantly away because they get called to be in the reserves into war. And so when you constantly have the men not around, the women need to take the reins on the household. So women developed more rights in Sparta. Some women owned land and ran their household when their husbands were away. They did not spend time weaving or making clothes because the slaves did most of that in Sparta. And the way Sparta begins, when they start becoming so militaristic, is they had a revolt. The slaves, or they also called helots, they consisted of 80% of the population in Sparta. So they had 80% of the population were slaves or helots. 20% were free, and they got to the point where the slaves revolted and the Spartans barely were able to keep their society together. And it was determined that the only way they'll keep themselves strong and stop any slave revolt from now on is if they're the biggest, baddest, strongest city-state around. So go ahead and write your one-page summary, and we'll see you at the next time we meet. Bye-bye.